So today I'm going to share with you my diagnosis journey. I found out I was on the spectrum about 3 years ago now, and at the time Aspergers put a name to something that I felt like I'd been struggling with my entire life. From as early as I can remember, I've had this feeling that I was different and that different was bad. So you can imagine that finally putting a name to that and embracing that difference was incredibly liberating. So this story today is probably going to be a little bit raw because I feel as though it would be more authentic of me to just keep talking and you can see a little bit more of my personality rather than heavily filtering it via editing and scripting and things like that. So hopefully that's okay with you. And also to help me keep my train of thought, I'll probably walk around a little bit because that really helps a lot in terms of remembering what I'm going to say and having that train of thought keep going. So my diagnosis, this is probably one of the most commonly asked questions. I do a lot of speaking gigs, so presenting to students and teachers and companies and things about how to leverage the strengths of autism and what autism is, and sharing my story and all of that kind of stuff. And they very often ask me, so you found out you're on the spectrum only just recently, like what happened? What's the story there? And usually there's not really much time for me to give a very detailed answer. So the short answer that I give is I read a book called Look Me in the Eye, My Life with Aspergers, which is an autobiography of John Elder Robinson. And I got about halfway through that book and it was resonating so deeply with me that I put the book down, Googled Aspergers, found a support group meeting, and everything snowballed from there. So that's the short answer, right? Satisfied? There's quite a few questions that kind of get left unanswered with such a concise answer. So that's what I want to share with you today in terms of my story, because the questions that come to mind are things like, I discovered I have Asperger's at the age of 30. How was it not obvious before then? What did I think autism was before I discovered that I was autistic? How did I go at school? How did I go with friends? All of that kind of stuff. So there's even quite a few things that I wasn't sure if I was happy sharing publicly, but I've decided to include them anyway, again, because I really believe in the power of honesty as a force that can connect us. So there'll be a couple of surprises that I'm a little bit nervous about, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. So I remember when I was really young, maybe 7 or 8, the first time I came across what autism was. And I must have heard the word or seen it on TV or something. And I remember asking my dad, what is autism? And to this day, I still remember the gist of the response. And basically the response was, a typical kid will play with toy trucks and cars and they will sort of roll them around and pretend that they're real, right? And the difference between that and an autistic kid is the autistic child will turn the car upside down and spin the wheels. So as like a 7 or 8-year-old, that sounded like a pretty good answer, and I felt like I knew what autism was now. In hindsight, I used to play with Matchbox cars, and I didn't turn them upside down and I didn't spin the wheels, but I didn't imagine that they were real cars. I was more interested in the physics of the situation. I was more interested in this object as an object rather than as what the object is supposed to represent. So for example, I would get 2 cars and I would basically collide them into each other and so they bounce off each other and see which one flipped over and which one didn't flip over. And that was really, really interesting to me. So I would have these epic battles where I'd get every single car and compete them against every other car and see which one was left at the end of this like duel. And I remember my very favorite one was like a Formula One racing car. and it always won because it was so low and all the other cars kind of went up over the top of it and flipped over. So it was by far my favorite. And then once I had a favorite, I used to like champion it, and it would go up against these massive trucks, like hundreds and thousands of times its size, and it would always win, of course, because it was, you know, in my imagination, this was my game. And the special secret was if you push down on the spoiler at the back of the car, it kind of flips up the front of the car. So if you do that at the right time, it kind of flips over the... Anyway. So that's clearly imaginative play, right? I was clearly being very imaginative. But what I wasn't doing was pretending that this little car was a little car. So I was almost being too imaginative, because for me, the idea of pretending this thing was an actual Formula One racing car and pretending it goes around a track in circles really fast, that was kind of boring. Whereas having an epic battle where it battles a monster truck 1,000 times its size was much more interesting. So anyway, that's beside the point. I guess what I'm trying to say is I had an idea of what autism was, and that idea didn't really fit me at all. So that's why I had no idea that I was on the spectrum. Meanwhile, I was in the special and gifted class at school, and I knew more about dinosaurs and planets than any other adult that I knew. After years of constant teasing, I finally found a couple of friends at primary school, which was all right at the time. And then when I went to high school, all of a sudden, how you socialize is instead of actually playing games, you just sit around and talk. So I spent the next like 5 or 10 years trying to learn how to have a conversation, going from speaking too much to not speaking enough to basically having absolutely no clue what to do. And that meant that I was always on the outer of any kind of group, and it was really hard to get a second chance to make a better impression when someone got to know me a bit better. So the next important part of the story is at the age of 16, I radically changed my hairstyle and I got dreadlocks. So I've made a couple of videos on this if you want to check out some of my other videos. But the crux of the story is that the dreadlocks radically changed how other people perceived me. So even though I wasn't any different, all of a sudden, they no longer saw me as boring and shy and awkward, right? I had this aura of confidence and stuff that I had no idea where it came from, but all of a sudden that's how they saw me. So my social life exploded virtually overnight, and the short answer to the story is that I never had trouble making friends ever since then. There was a particular quality about the dreadlocks themselves and the image that they gave me that basically covered up all of those natural weaknesses that I'd been struggling with in the previous years. So with those weaknesses covered up by the dreadlocks, compensated for by this magical, amazing coping strategy of my hair, no one suspected that I might have Asperger's, not even me, right? So I finished high school, I went through university, I got a job, I got married, I bought a house, and everything was seemingly going really, really well. So by this stage, my impression of what Asperger's was started to be influenced, I guess, by characters like Sheldon from The Big Bang Theory. And I remember sitting at my desk in my engineering office reading some kind of statistic, like the headline reads, engineers are 10% more likely to have autistic children. And I remember laughing out loud thinking, are you serious? Engineers are 10% more likely to be autistic. Looking around the office, high intelligence, narrow interests, poor social skills. Engineers tend to tick a lot of those autistic traits boxes, right? To give you some idea of the level of obsession, I was working for Boeing as an aircraft structural engineer, and so a lot of the other guys would describe themselves as aerosexuals because they loved planes so much, right? That's the kind of level of obsession that we're talking about here. So anyway, at this stage, I started thinking, maybe that is me. I mean, I do tick a lot of those boxes. So I went online and I looked up autism and I looked up Asperger's, and I basically got a list of things that I shouldn't be good at. So troubles with communication, troubles making friends, repetitive behavior, all of those kind of things. And I thought, can I really say that I have a deficit in my communication? Can I really say that I've had troubles making friends? I mean, sure, as a teenager, but doesn't everyone have trouble making friends as a teenager? That's a very turbulent time. What else? Yeah, can I really say the repetitive behavior is a problem? So it was a stretch. It was a real stretch. And I came to the conclusion that in a similar way, so my wife at the time was studying psychology, and it was a well-known phenomenon that every class she went to, she'd come back and say, oh, I've got this new condition I've just diagnosed myself with. I've just learnt about this and it's exactly me. So I thought, am I just doing that? Am I just projecting some of this stuff onto myself just because I tick a couple of the boxes? So I diagnosed myself as an engineer, and I I argued to myself that engineers have all of these traits that are kind of in common with autism. So I'm not autistic, I'm just an engineer, and there's no way you could really, it'd be a bit of a stretch to call that a disability in my case. Another factor that led me to put the idea of myself being on the spectrum to bed completely at the time was I had an in-law who was so stereotypically Aspie, it was not funny. Like you could just put a camera on him and make it into a TV show. He was high achieving, he was an academic, he had done a PhD, he spent most of his time alone with his computer, he wasn't good at body language or reading social cues, he would just talk to you at length and have no idea that you have no interest in whatever he's talking about. He had some friends, but I'm talking like 3 or 4, right? So fit the social categories as well. And it was so obvious to us at the time that he was on the spectrum that it wasn't even a question. It wasn't, oh, maybe he's on the spectrum, maybe we should look into this. It was open and shut case, so we didn't even talk about it. So with all those things put together, they formed my perception of what autism was in real life, and I came to the very firm conclusion at the time, there's no way that I'm on the spectrum, because I'm not like this guy over here, and I don't really fit those diagnostic criteria with all those deficits, and I'm not like Sheldon from the Big Bang Theory, at least not, we share a few things in common, but nowhere near as extreme as that. So that closed the book for me at the time for another couple of years. So hopefully that's answered some of the questions around how I spent 30 years not knowing that I was on the spectrum. So stay tuned for part 2 of this diagnosis journey, where I will be sharing what the turning point was, where it suddenly all clicked, and all of those reservations, thinking that these things don't apply to me, I finally understood what they really were in real life and how I actually do tick all of those boxes. So I hope you've enjoyed this story so far, and stay tuned for the next segment next week. Okay, bye.
If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and hit subscribe for weekly content just like this one. If you'd like to get even more involved, you can join the discussion on social media or support me by becoming a patron. Finally, I value your time, and you'll notice all my videos are ad-free, so please help me to cover what you want to hear by leaving me a comment and telling me what you think. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you another time.